My baby girl was being lowered into the ground, and my parents were clinking champagne glasses at a pool party. That's not a metaphor. That's not an exaggeration. That's the day I buried my 6-month-old daughter, Lily, alone, while my parents celebrated my brother Brian's engagement under a string of fairy lights and floating pool floats. My name is Isabel. I was 29 when I realized my family never truly saw me. Not when I was a child, not when I became a mother, and definitely not when I needed them most. It's just a baby, my mother said when I begged her to come. Brian's party is more important. That sentence broke something in me that's never quite healed, but it also awakened something else: resolve. If they could treat my daughter's death as an inconvenience, I could make sure they'd regret it in a way they'd never forget. Growing up, I used to believe our family was normal. My parents, Carol and Dennis, weren't particularly affectionate, but they were stable, present, and structured. Our home was clean, our meals always on time, and we never missed a birthday. At least Brian's birthdays. I was 2 years younger than my brother, and I worshipped him as most little sisters do. He was charming, athletic, and had a natural ability to make people laugh. I was quieter, bookish, and always trying just a little too hard. I remember staying up late the night before Brian's 12th birthday party to help my mom bake cupcakes. I'd drawn a banner for him and asked if I could give a speech during the party. "That's sweet, honey," she said, patting my head distractedly. "But this is Brian's big day. Let's not take the spotlight, okay?" I didn't take it personally. I never did, not at first. I wanted to be the kind of daughter who didn't need constant attention, the one who supported the family from the background. I cheered the loudest at Brian's soccer games, even when he barely acknowledged me in the crowd. I cleaned up the kitchen when my mom was tired. I brought home straight A's and thought maybe, just maybe, this time they'd be proud. They were, in their own way. "That's our Isabel," Dad would say, with a nod and a sip of his coffee. Then he'd ask Brian about the next big game, or his science project, or whether he wanted steak or chicken for dinner. When I got into the top science camp in middle school, they barely blinked. When Brian made the school paper for scoring a goal, they framed it. Things didn't really change when we became adults. If anything, the distance widened. Brian moved into marketing straight out of college, landed a well-paying job in the city, and dated a string of glamorous women. My parents beamed with pride at every promotion, every vacation photo he posted. Meanwhile, I went to nursing school, worked overnight shifts, paid off student loans, fell in love with Aaron. We bought a modest house an hour away, and for the first time, I felt like I was building a life on my own terms. When I told them we were pregnant, I expected at least a flicker of joy. My mother blinked and asked, "Did Brian tell you he might get a company car?" I forced a smile. "No, Mom, but we're having a baby." "Oh," she said. "Well, I guess that's nice." Heron's parents were the opposite: warm, curious, and genuinely excited. They came to every prenatal checkup they could, brought homemade soups when I was too nauseated to cook, and crocheted little hats for our baby before she was even born. Still, I clung to the hope that maybe, when they met Lily, something would shift. She arrived on a cold January morning, with Aaron's dark hair and my stubborn blue eyes. Holding her for the first time felt like holding sunlight. Warm, impossible, holy. I texted my mom the news, followed by a photo. She responded 4 hours later, "Cute. What's her name again?" They visited the hospital once. My dad hovered near the door. My mom brought a fruit basket and left after 30 minutes. She had a spa appointment. I told myself they were just awkward with babies, that it would get better. That surely once they saw her laugh or reach for their hands or take her first steps, they'd fall in love. And so I tried. I invited them for Sunday brunches, sent photo updates every week. Here's Lily smiling. Here's Lily in her bunny pajamas. I received a thumbs up emoji. Once, I baked my mother's favorite lemon bars for Mother's Day. She thanked me and asked if Brian had mentioned his upcoming trip to Aruba. My dad spent most of the visit reading news on his phone. Despite the constant dismissals, I didn't cut them off. Part of me still needed their approval. Part of me hoped they'd surprise me one day, that they'd show up, not out of obligation, but because they wanted to, that they'd finally see me. They never did, but I never stopped giving them chances until they made it unforgivable. Looking back, I don't know why I ignored the signs for so long. Maybe because they started small, almost invisible. A skipped phone call, a forgotten birthday, an awkward silence when I shared good news. It was always something subtle. When I landed my first job as a pediatric nurse, I called my mom excitedly. "That's nice," she said. "Brian just got offered a client in Switzerland. Isn't that something?" She didn't ask where I'd be working. She didn't even ask when I started. Every family dinner was the Brian show, Brian's new condo, Brian's new girlfriend, Brian's gluten-free phase. They asked for my opinion on wedding venues for his latest fiancée before they ever asked how Lily was sleeping. When we bought our house, I invited my parents to visit the next weekend. My mom said they'd try, but they had tickets to a wine tasting event that Saturday and were simply exhausted on Sunday. They eventually stopped by 3 weeks later on their way to Brian's place, spent 20 minutes inspecting our backyard, and left before dessert. Aaron, ever the optimist, kept encouraging me. "They'll come around," he'd say. "They're just stuck in their ways." I nodded. I wanted to believe it. I wanted my daughter to have grandparents who loved her, like Aaron's did, who remembered her birthday, who noticed when she took her first step. But the gap only widened. When Lily was 4 months old, Aaron's parents threw a small brunch to celebrate her christening. My parents showed up 20 minutes late and left before the group photo. I overheard my mom whispering to my dad, "Let's not stay too long. We still have to prep for Brian's fundraiser." Fundraiser for a grown man's pet project while their granddaughter was being baptized. Then came the day I asked them for help. Aaron had the flu. I hadn't slept in 3 nights. Lily was fussy, teething, and I was on the brink of collapse. I called my mom, voice shaking. "Could you come by for a bit? Just an hour or two so I can nap?" Her sigh was audible. "Isabel, I told you we're going antiquing with Brian. Can't Aaron's parents help?" They could. They did. But it stung that I even had to ask. What hurt more was when I finally said something. It was after one of Brian's birthday dinners. Steakhouse, private room, fancy drinks. I'd baked a cake for him and brought it to the restaurant. My mom took one bite and said, "You used almond extract, didn't you? You know Brian doesn't like that." No thank you, no appreciation, just criticism. Later that night, as we were driving home, I said to Aaron, "I don't think they even like me, or Lily." He didn't argue, he just reached for my hand. I started journaling after that, little notes to myself, things I noticed, like how my parents always called me by my full name, Isabel, while Brian got nicknames and praise, or how my mom would share every small update from Brian's life like it was headline news, but didn't even know the name of Lily's daycare. The final straw before the funeral came during Lily's 6-month checkup. Her doctor called her development textbook perfect. I texted my mom immediately, thrilled. Her response? "Good. Brian just got a new office view on the 14th floor." They didn't ask for a photo. They didn't even ask how I was doing. The contrast between their behavior and Aaron's parents' love made it worse. His mom brought over home-cooked meals every Thursday. His dad helped install safety locks around the house. They called Lily our little star and printed a calendar with her baby photos. My parents sent a Christmas card. It had Brian's face on it, holding a cocktail. I wasn't just invisible, I was expendable. But I still didn't give up. I still showed up. I still tried to earn what should have been freely given: love, respect, attention. I sent them a framed photo of Lily in her Easter dress. They never acknowledged it. My mom posted a photo of Brian's Easter centerpiece instead. It didn't matter how hard I tried. In their eyes, I would always come second, even to a swimming pool. Lily died on a Tuesday night. That morning, she'd been giggling in her high chair, smashing blueberries against her tray, babbling at the cat who wisely kept its distance. She'd had a mild cold earlier that week, nothing serious. The pediatrician said it was a typical virus, told us to keep her hydrated, let it pass. By Tuesday, she seemed almost back to normal. Her eyes were bright again, and she reached for my face with those chubby fingers that always made me laugh. We went through our usual bedtime routine, a warm bath, her favorite lullaby, a bottle, then sleep. Erin kissed her forehead and whispered, "Good night, my little star." I adjusted her sleep sack, checked the monitor, then crawled into bed beside him. When I woke up just after 6, something felt wrong. Lily usually stirred by 5, fussing for a bottle, but the monitor had been silent. Too silent. I walked into her room still half asleep. The walls were painted pale yellow with forest animal decals we'd put up ourselves. Her crib looked peaceful, too peaceful. "Lily?" I whispered, stepping closer. She didn't move. Her face was still, her skin cold. I don't remember screaming, but Aaron said he heard it before he even opened his eyes. The next moments blurred into chaos. Aaron trying CPR, my fingers shaking as I dialed 911, the paramedics arriving, their grim expressions, the ambulance ride, the hospital's fluorescent lights, the doctor's quiet voice. "I'm so sorry. She's gone." SIDS, they said, sudden infant death syndrome, no explanation, no prevention, just a hole where our child used to be. Everything that came after was surreal, a blur of decisions we never imagined making: casket, flowers, burial plot, words we could barely say aloud. Aaron's parents dropped everything to be with us. They made phone calls, held us when we collapsed, cleaned our kitchen without being asked. They cried with us. They grieved like grandparents who had truly loved their grandchild. I called my parents from the hospital that morning. "Mom," I said, my voice hoarse. "Lily died last night." There was a pause, a long one. "Oh," she said, "that's terrible." Nothing more. No, "We're on our way." No, "How are you holding up?" No tears. I'll text you funeral details," I managed. "Yes, let us know," she replied. The funeral was scheduled for Friday at 11 a.m. at Willow Grove Cemetery. I chose a white casket with pink roses. It looked far too small. The chapel was reserved, the service planned with care. I told my parents everything: time, location, even a list of family friends who would attend. Thursday night, my mom called. "Abby," she said breezily. She always called me Abby when she wanted something. "I just realized Brian's engagement pool party is also Friday morning. Isn't that a coincidence?" My stomach clenched. "So?" I asked. "Well, we've already committed. The caterer's booked. It's too late to reschedule." She was silent. "You understand, right?" she added. "This is Brian's big moment." "Lily's funeral," I said slowly, "is Friday at 11. She was your granddaughter." "I know, but Brian's event is important too. Lily, she was just a baby." I think my heart cracked right then. That was the moment I knew, really knew, they would never change. "She was just a baby," my mother repeated. "You and Aaron can try again, but Brian only gets one engagement party." I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I just said, "I see," and hung up. The next day, as Aaron and I stood beneath a gray sky saying goodbye to our daughter, my parents were laughing poolside with mimosas in hand. My brother posted a photo, my mother in a sun hat, my father raising a glass, Brian holding his fiancée like he'd won a prize. I stared at those photos in numb disbelief, sitting on our couch in the dark hours after the burial. My black dress still clung to me. My eyes ached from crying. My soul ached more. Aaron didn't speak for a long time. Then he whispered, "They weren't just absent, they chose not to be there." I nodded, because the truth was, they did make a choice. They chose a pool party over their own granddaughter's funeral, and I would never forget it. The silence from them afterward was almost worse than the betrayal itself. No call to check in, no flowers, no card, not even a text. Erin's mother, on the other hand, came over every morning for a week just to sit with me. She didn't try to fix anything. She just sat there, sometimes holding my hand, sometimes crying with me. She said Lily's name aloud. She told me stories about the first time she held her. She remembered things I'd forgotten, like the time Lily tried to grab her glasses with a squeak. "Your daughter mattered," she whispered once. "She mattered so much." The day after the funeral, my Aunt Beth, my mother's sister, called. "Why weren't your parents there?" she asked gently. We were all so confused. I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. They had another event. Beth paused. "I heard they were at Brian's pool party." My throat tightened. "They were." "Oh, Isabel," her voice cracked. "I'm so sorry." Apparently, the story was spreading. Cousins texted me in disbelief. Old friends who'd attended the funeral reached out, asking how I was holding up. I didn't respond to most. I didn't have the words. Erin printed out the pool party Instagram post, the one with my parents in the background, drinks in hand, laughing. He placed it in a drawer in case I ever needed it. "You don't have to keep that," I told him. "I don't want you to ever doubt what happened," he said. "You're not imagining this." He was right. Part of me kept thinking maybe I'd exaggerated it. Maybe I was too emotional, too grief-stricken. But I wasn't. They chose, and their choice broke me. The days after the funeral stretched like cold shadows. I moved through them mechanically. Wake up, shower, try to eat, cry, sleep, repeat. I'd stand in Lily's nursery at night, staring at her empty crib. My breasts ached with milk she would never drink. My arms physically longed to hold her. Sometimes I'd reach for my phone out of habit, ready to text a new photo, and remember there would be no new photos, just memories. And still, no word from my parents until 1 week later. My mom called as if nothing had happened. "We're having Sunday dinner," she said. "You and Erin should come. It'll help you get out of the house." I almost dropped the phone. "Dinner?" I asked flatly. "Yes, Brian and his fiancée will be there. We want to hear all about their honeymoon options. It'll be fun." "Mom," I said, my voice hollow, "Lily died a week ago." There was a pause. "I know, honey, but you have to move forward. Dwelling won't bring her back." Ended the call. That night, I stared at the ceiling and made a decision. If they wouldn't acknowledge what they'd done, I would make them. Not with shouting, not with revenge, but with truth and consequences. The funeral passed like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. Brian didn't show. My parents didn't show. The only family present were Erin's parents, who stood with us through every excruciating moment. Lily's casket was so small, white with tiny silver handles, adorned with a wreath of pale pink roses. As the pastor spoke, I found myself numb, watching the sky more than listening to the words. It felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unravel from outside my own body. At the burial, I broke. Watching that tiny casket lowered into the earth was the final blow. Erin had to hold me up as I threw the first handful of dirt. My mother-in-law wept beside me, whispering prayers. All I could hear were my parents' words, "It's just a baby." When we got home, silence swallowed us. I left Lily's nursery untouched. Her crib, the rocking chair, the little clothes folded neatly in drawers. Everything stayed exactly the same. I couldn't bear to change it. Every time I walked past, I hoped for a cry. Just once more. But the monitor remained silent. Aaron returned to work too soon. He thought routine would help. It didn't. He came home quiet, withdrawn. We barely spoke. Grief had built a wall between us, each isolated in our own pain. I stopped answering messages. Even well-meaning texts like "thinking of you" felt unbearable. I deactivated my social media after stumbling across photos from Brian's engagement party, our parents beaming, champagne in hand, toasting to the future while their granddaughter was buried. The betrayal clung to me like a second skin. I replayed the phone call over and over. "You can always have another baby," as if Lily were replaceable, as if her death was a minor inconvenience. I couldn't sleep. Nightmares plagued me. I'd wake reaching for a cry that never came. Once I woke screaming, convinced I'd heard Lily's voice. Aaron rushed in, panic etched on his face. We held each other that night, both sobbing. It was the first time in days we had truly connected. Days bled into each other. I forgot to eat. I sat in the nursery for hours, clutching her blanket, inhaling what little scent remained. I wrote letters to Lily in a journal, pages and pages of guilt, love, longing. I blamed myself. Did I miss something? Could I have saved her? One afternoon, a package arrived from a colleague at the hospital. It was a framed photo of Lily and me, taken during a picnic Aaron's parents had hosted. We were both smiling, genuine, unguarded joy. Tucked in the frame was a note. Her life mattered. I see your pain. I'm here. That photo broke me open. I sobbed for hours, but something shifted. For the first time, I didn't feel completely alone. Still, the anger simmered, not just at my parents, but at myself, for ever believing they would change. For letting them hold Lily, for letting them exist in her world when they had never truly seen her. The lowest point came one morning when I couldn't get out of bed. Aaron found me curled on the floor, still in the dress I'd worn the day before. "You need help," he said gently, voice cracking. "We both do." That week, we began grief counseling. Our therapist, Dr. Patel, didn't rush us. She sat with our silence, asked about Lily, let us tell her everything from the moment she was born to the moment we buried her. "You are grieving two deaths," she said. "Your daughter's and the fantasy of the family you hoped would show up for her." Those words resonated deeply. I had clung to illusions my whole life, that my parents would love me equally, that one day they would truly see me, that Lily's birth might change them, but her death had only solidified the truth. They had never seen me, and they never would. In one session, I described standing at the funeral, scanning the crowd, hoping for a glimpse of my mother. "That hope," Dr. Patel said softly, "is what you need to bury." It was brutal, but it was honest. I wasn't ready to forgive. I wasn't even ready to confront, but I was ready to begin, not to move on, but to move forward. And the first step was this. I printed that photo my colleague had sent and placed it in the nursery, right above Lily's crib. A reminder that someone had seen her, that she had been loved, that her life, however brief, mattered. And so did mine. The decision to confront my parents didn't come overnight. It festered and simmered in the quiet, in the silence after the funeral, in the empty glances toward Lily's untouched crib. At first, I wasn't sure what I wanted: an apology, understanding, retribution. But I knew one thing: I couldn't let them erase her, not in words, not in memory. I began by writing everything down. Every memory, every betrayal, every slight comment that had made me feel less than. I turned our guest room into a war room, one wall lined with sticky notes, timelines, printouts of text messages, photos. Aaron didn't interfere. He understood. This was about reclaiming my story. I wrote a letter, a long, searing letter addressed to my parents. It wasn't polite. It wasn't diplomatic. It was raw truth. I wrote about Lily, about her laugh, her sleepy coos, how she loved the giraffe mobile above her crib, about the way they barely looked at her, never learned her schedule, never held her long enough to understand her scent. I wrote about the funeral, about standing alone, eyes scanning the crowd for faces that never arrived, about the Instagram photos of them smiling 3 miles away. I ended the letter with a line I practiced saying aloud. "You told me my daughter didn't matter, but I will never let you forget that she did." Aaron and I debated whether I should deliver it in person or by post. Eventually, I decided they needed to hear it directly. They needed to see my face. The confrontation was set for a Sunday afternoon. I had texted them ahead of time saying I wanted to talk just us three. My father's reply was brief, "All right." My mother responded with her usual cheer, "I'll make lemon squares." The drive to their house was surreal. The streets were familiar, but everything felt foreign. I wore Lily's birthstone around my neck and a blouse the same soft purple as the onesie she'd worn in her last photo. My parents welcomed me like it was a holiday visit. My mother reached to hug me. I stepped back. "Let's sit." We settled in the living room, the one they kept pristine for guests. I placed a framed photo of Lily on the coffee table. My father frowned. My mother tilted her head. "She looks like you." "She was your granddaughter," I said. "What's this about, Abby?" my father asked. "My name is Lily," I said clearly. "I'm here as her mother." They didn't understand. That was fine. I hadn't expected them to. I took out the letter and began reading aloud. My voice trembled at first, but as I continued, I steadied. The words had weight. They filled the room. They left no room for denial. I told them how I had begged them to come, how they chose cake and cocktails over closure, how I had watched their lies crumble in the faces of relatives who'd believed them sick, not selfish. Show them screenshots, photos, a timeline. I watched their faces as I read. My mother cried. My father shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. When I finished, I looked at them for a long time. "I'm not here for an apology," I said. "I'm here to draw a line. You don't get to pretend you cared. You don't get to rewrite this." My mother whispered, "We didn't know you felt this way." "That's the point," I said. "You never asked." There was silence. Then my father finally spoke. "What do you want from us?" "I want you to sit with what you did," I said. "I want you to understand the gravity of your absence, and until you do, I need distance. For Lily, for me." I stood up, picked up the photo. "This is the last time I come here, without truth between us." As I left, my mother called my name. I didn't turn back. Later that night, I received a message from my cousin. A simple line. "I heard what happened. I'm proud of you." For the first time in weeks, I exhaled. That confrontation wasn't revenge. It was reclamation. I hadn't yelled, I hadn't begged, I had simply laid the truth before them and walked away. Lily mattered, I mattered, and now they knew. Silence has a sound, and it echoed loudly after our confrontation. 3 weeks passed. No calls, no texts, no unexpected visits. Yet, I didn't feel abandoned. In fact, the stillness felt like a balm, giving my wounds the air they needed to start breathing again. Then a letter arrived. It was from my father. His handwriting, neat and rigid, filled 2 pages. "I don't know what to say," it began, "but I've read your letter again and again, and you're right, we failed you, not just at Lily's funeral, but over a lifetime. I'm ashamed, and I'm sorry." It wasn't poetic, it wasn't eloquent, but it was honest. A week later, a small package appeared on our doorstep. Inside was a delicate silver necklace with Lily's birthstone, engraved with 2 simple words: "She mattered." No name, no note, but I knew it was from my mother. We still hadn't spoken, no visits, no expectations, just gestures. Hesitant, imperfect, but real. What I didn't expect was Brian. He showed up on a gray, cold afternoon, hands shoved in his coat pockets, looking more like the little brother I used to chase around the yard than the man whose party replaced my daughter's funeral. "I didn't get it," he said. "Honestly, I thought you were just being dramatic, that you were making too big a deal out of it." I said nothing, letting the silence carry its own weight. But then I saw Mom's face after reading your letter. I saw Dad trying to write his, and I started to realize maybe it was me who didn't understand. He pulled something from his coat, a small potted lily. "I didn't know what to bring," he said awkwardly. This felt right. It wasn't redemption, it wasn't a full apology, but it was something. And sometimes something is enough. Slowly, my family began to shift. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but noticeably. My mother asked about Lily's favorite songs. My father donated in her name to a children's hospital. Brian posted about her on what would have been her first birthday with a photo of white lilies and the words, "For the niece I barely knew, but will never forget. They weren't pretending anymore, and that, to me, meant everything. The biggest shift came at Lily's remembrance ceremony, held quietly in the garden Aaron and I had built. I hadn't told my parents, not directly, but somehow they came. My mother held a bouquet of white roses. My father wore a dark suit and stood quietly near the back. When You Are My Sunshine played, softly strummed on a friend's guitar, I glanced up to see tears slipping down my mother's face. No theatrics, just grief. After the ceremony, she approached me. "May I see Lily's photo album?" she asked. I handed it to her. She sat on a bench and flipped through it page by page, her fingers trembling as they brushed over Lily's bright blue eyes and toothless smile. "She looked so much like you when you were a baby," she whispered. And in that moment, I realized something essential. They would never be the parents I had needed growing up. But maybe, just maybe, they could start trying now. And perhaps that was enough. 6 months after Lily's funeral, I stood in the garden we had built in her memory. Tulips were blooming, birds were chirping, and a soft breeze stirred the wind chimes Aaron had hung above the angel statue. The pain was still there, ever present, but it no longer ruled me. It had become part of my breath. Softer, steadier, but always real. Healing wasn't linear. Some mornings I woke up with a lump in my throat and tears that didn't make sense. Some nights I would sit in Lily's memorial room holding her blanket, whispering stories she'd never hear. But there were also days of peace, like the one where I laughed for the first time without guilt, or the afternoon Aaron and I danced barefoot in the kitchen, remembering Lily's giggle. Grief counseling had helped us rebuild our marriage. The pain had driven us apart in the early weeks, both of us lost in our own mourning. But with Dr. Patel's guidance, we learned how to grieve together, not in isolation. We joined a support group for parents who had lost infants. There, I met Rachel, a young mother whose in-laws had told her to just try again a month after her baby's death. Her pain mirrored mine. I told her about the pool party, about my parents, about standing alone at a funeral. "What did you do?" she asked. "I stood up for Lily," I said, "and for myself." It didn't bring her back, but it made sure she was honored. Inspired by that group, I started volunteering with a nonprofit that supports grieving families. My nursing background helped, but it was my loss that allowed me to truly see people. Each mother's tears were a reflection of my own. Each father's silence echoed Aaron's. In helping them, I healed myself. Aaron and I began to talk cautiously about having another child, not to replace Lily, nothing ever could, but to grow, to hope again. "I'm terrified," I confessed one night. "So am I," he said, "but maybe that's okay." My relationship with my parents had shifted too. It would never be perfect, but boundaries were set, apologies were made, and most importantly, Lily's name was never ignored again. 1 year after Lily's death, we held a remembrance in our garden. My parents came, Brian came, even Stephanie. Everyone brought something small, a note, a flower, a photo. We lit candles, we shared stories, we cried. And in the quiet that followed, I knew grief would always walk beside me. But I wasn't alone anymore, and I wasn't broken. I was healing. Lily's life, brief as it was, had taught me love. Her death had taught me truth. And from both, I'd built a future worth living. That spring, I planted a cherry tree beside the angel statue. I imagined Lily growing with its blossoms season after season. When the first bloom opened, I touched the soft petal and whispered, "You are remembered." I also wrote an article for a medical journal, humanizing pediatric loss, blending clinical insights with my personal journey. It was my way of ensuring no healthcare worker would ever again tell a grieving parent, "You can try again," as if lives were replaceable. Sometimes I still dream of her, giggling, reaching for me with pudgy arms. I wake with tears and a bittersweet ache in my chest. but I also wake with purpose, with strength, with love that has only deepened. And every day I choose to live in a way that honors her, with truth, with tenderness, and with the fierce belief that even the smallest lives leave the biggest marks. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that grief doesn't just expose the truth, it demands it. Losing Lily was the deepest pain I've ever known, but being forced to face that pain alone, abandoned by the people who should have stood beside me, added an entirely different layer of hurt. It revealed who truly cared, who showed up, and who saw my daughter's life as worth mourning. But it also showed me something else, the power of my own voice. For years, I silenced myself. I minimized my pain, my needs, my worth, all to preserve peace, to maintain relationships that were never truly nurturing. But Lily changed that. Her brief life gave me the courage to demand better, not just for her memory, but for myself. I learned that setting boundaries isn't cruel, it's necessary. That choosing distance over dysfunction isn't weakness, it's strength. And that speaking your truth, even when your voice shakes, is one of the bravest things you can do. I also realized that family is not just blood, it's the people who hold your hand in the darkest hour, who say your child's name without flinching, who sit with your sorrow without trying to fix it. In Aaron, in his parents, in the community of grieving parents, I discovered a new definition of family, one built on empathy, presence, and love. If you're reading this and you face something similar, betrayal, abandonment, unbearable loss, please know your grief is valid, your pain matters. You deserve to be surrounded by people who honor it. And if you've ever wondered whether it's okay to walk away from those who don't, it is. Lily taught me that even the smallest life can ignite the biggest transformation, and for the rest of mine, I will carry her light forward in every choice I make, every truth I tell, every boundary I set. She mattered, I matter, and so do you.